and welcome to Stowe Talks, a podcast designed to support people going through a relationship breakdown and all of the challenges this brings. I'm Matthew Taylor.
And I'm Lisa Gatchell, family lawyers at Stowe Family Law, and today we are delighted to welcome Lucy Wade, a domestic abuse consultant, to look at the impact of domestic abuse in minority communities. So welcome to the podcast, Lucy. It's really great to have you here with us today. Could you start by just introducing yourself for anyone that's listening?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I feel very honoured. Yes, my name's Lucy and I am the creator and owner of You Don't Own Me, which is a website that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse from all areas of society. It's a one-stop shop, lots of useful blogs, resources on there, guest blogs from professionals. I also host a podcast called Dip In and Out with Lucy. And again, that's with lots of various professionals around domestic abuse and domestic violence. And it's to give people options as to how they want to access support if it's something they feel they're not sure is right for them, or even if they need it. So it's just another avenue of looking at support in a bit of a different way.
Well, great. Well, we've talked about domestic abuse quite a bit on the podcast and in all sorts of guises and in different areas. This is the first time we've really dug into it specifically in terms of the impact that has on people from minority communities, which I think is going to be absolutely fascinating. I'm really interested to kind of explore some of the dynamics, some of the cultural considerations, language barriers, things like that. I mean, I'm conscious that initially that the phrase minority communities is pretty wide, and that's going to encompass a huge kind of number of areas, different communities with I'm sure their own kind of bespoke issues. I mean, when we're talking about minority communities, are there particular areas that you focus on that we should discuss in particular today, or is there stuff that's kind of universal to all sorts of different communities?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of both, definitely, because there'll be things that I can cover that do actually cover the wider community and society as a whole, which maybe people don't realise. Very much around, in fact, I've just recorded an episode that's coming out in the new year with a lady called Dr. Aisha Ahmed, and we focus on BAME community. We focus as in Black, Asian minority ethnic groups, and she focused very much on Bangladeshi and South Asian communities. So it's probably quite useful if I go through a little bit around what we've discussed as well in terms of the challenges and impact on those from those communities.
Okay, well, that sounds really useful, and you know, it gives us a bit of a focus for things. I mean, let's maybe just take a step back and do our kind of a wider pieces. When we're talking about domestic abuse, what are we talking about? Can we break it down into the various areas? And you know, I think less and less people hear domestic abuse and think domestic violence. I think that's less and less of an issue, but there's still a degree to which that happens, and obviously it's wider than that, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're right. It is thankfully becoming less and less people sort of having that, you know, domestic violence rather than domestic abuse. And I will always use the term domestic abuse because obviously violence is part of the abuse, but it isn't always just limited to violence. There is obviously the financial, there's the emotional, psychological, sexual. There's so many areas where abuse is prevalent. And we are thankfully stepping away from that idea that it is always about the physical aspect. Sadly, you do find victims and survivors asking the question, well, is it abuse if my partner doesn't hit me, if my parent doesn't hit me, whoever it is? And that's where we have to kind of break down those stigmas around what abuse actually encompasses.
Do you find that within different communities, there is different types of domestic abuse that are more prevalent?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because obviously it depends on who you speak to. And one thing I always say is abuse is unique to that person, and how somebody reacts to the situation they're in is unique to them. The way one person reacts is very, very different to the way someone else will, regardless of the community you are in. I do think that coercive control is something that is now being spoken about more and more. And again, within communities, it is that, I mean, I'll touch on it a bit more around why there are those challenges in terms of either leaving a situation or a relationship, and what kind of makes somebody stay. And again, it is that tie within the wider community as to why people do that. But I would say it is individual to that person. You know, I've worked with people who will say it's very much around the psychological abuse, and not just from their partner, but from the extended family, especially within minority communities. It's not just the partner, and the community within themselves can be quite controlling as well. So, I think it is very individual.
I think what you say about the wider community is a really interesting point. So in cases that I've had that have been abuse cases, and I can think of a couple in the South Asian community, which kind of links back to what you were saying before, the structure of those communities can be very different to kind of wider societal structures, in that the community is a lot stronger, a lot closer, and that's got some great benefits, doesn't it? The wider family unit, the idea of family is a lot wider probably, and the idea of community is probably a lot closer than kind of a lot of other communities, which has some great benefits. But at a point where there is a relationship breakdown and when there's abuse, that can be problematic, because there are still some views, I think, that I've certainly found, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, that domestic abuse is not to be talked about, is something that happens behind closed doors and should stay behind closed doors. And there is quite often a pressure, because there's still a bit of a stigma around divorce often in communities because of religious or cultural reasons, that there is a great pressure on people who've experienced abuse to, well, can't you just put up with it? Can't you reconcile? I can think of a couple of fairly big cases that I've had where that has happened. I mean, is that common, or am I just speaking to a fairly small sample size and that's not a wider experience?
No, it's 100%. You're right, it is. And one of the things I touched on when I was talking to Dr. Ahmed was the irony of the link between, say, the Roman Catholic Church, for example, and the shame and blame and the faith aspect, that if you divorce from the Roman Catholic faith, for example, you aren't allowed to have communion because you're divorced. If you brought shame on your community, if you like. Very much the same within the Bangladeshi community, as an example, is it's about their faith is very important. And I think where as a wider society we don't understand, and this is why we need to understand more about the complexities of religion within different communities, is it is very much embedded in their community, their faith. And therefore, if we understand a bit more about what those pressures are around that faith, around why they believe what they believe, then maybe we would have a better chance at being able to support people. I know myself, when I worked for the charity I work for, I used to go out into the community and I would just sort of ask somebody, could I come along to their women's empowerment group? And I went along to one where we were doing henna, and I was just sitting amongst people and we were just chatting. And there's no line saying it is very difficult when you're the one person there potentially that is white and everybody else is from that community. But once you show a level of respect and understanding and you build that trust, people are more likely to speak to you. I think there's and again, this is something I touched on with Dr. Ahmed, is I think very much people from minority groups feel that they are misunderstood and they are stereotyped. And I think that's why they don't want to speak out very often, because they feel as though they've been pigeonholed already before they even say anything. And I think by doing what I was trying to do, which is going out into the community and making it clear that I'm here to listen, that I'm here to find out where there are barriers to support, what can we do to help you in the community. It's time and it's patience, and you've just got to have the patience to listen.
I would definitely say of the clients that I've spoken to, there is a fear. There, particularly that if there is abuse within their relationship, or even if there's not abuse and they're just looking at a relationship breakdown that they feel may be shunned by their community because within their religious context, etc., it brings shame and things. There is such a fear as to the unknown as well, because it's okay, if I take this step and I move out of this situation, do I have to leave everything behind? Am I leaving everything that I know, and how will I be supported? And that must be 1,000 times more than the worry that is there for the majority of society, if you like, that there is always a worry, isn't there? That, I'm separating, I've got to start a new life, I've got to buy a new house, can I afford to do these things? But where we're looking at these minority communities where they are so tight, and there is the potential of them sort of moving, having to leave that or feel that they have to leave that entirely. That can really sort of, I can't say the word.
Exacerbate?
That's the one I'm looking for. Thank you, Matt. Exacerbate that. Is that, what can you do in those circumstances?
I was just going to say, one of the notes I had made for myself was to touch on that, because something that I've found is, well, there are probably several fold, but I'll try and cover them. One in particular is you very much find, say, mothers from BAME community are very, especially when I've worked with people who are in either refuge or accommodation, And the fear is that their children are going to be taken away from them. There's this preconceived idea that if they leave their community and they go into, say, emergency housing or emergency accommodation, that's it, their children are going to be removed from them. So it's kind of breaking down those stigmas around what support there is. Also, you're 100% right. When you are part of a very strong community, that is your support network. So to say to somebody, look, you would be safer and you would be in a better position if you were no longer in that situation. You're asking somebody to leave everything they've ever known. They're very close-knit, and very often you find multi-generational families living together. So there's a huge level of support there. And therefore, if that is then removed, and you're asking not only the person to leave, but potentially move out of the area, because very often if there is a safeguarding issue, it will be that that person will need to move out of the area. The abuser stays in the area, but the individual potentially with the children has to move out of the area. Well, then not only are you trying to rebuild your life, but you're trying to rebuild your life with people not understanding your faith, not understanding your culture. And it's, you can't blame people. It's a very, very scary place to be, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at uprooting someone's whole life, and it must be a challenge to their identity, because you draw your identity from the community of which you're a part. What about awareness in general, in a sort of a wider sense of what constitutes domestic abuse in minority communities? I think, again, just going back to some of the cases that I've been involved in, and it's a kind of running theme of women not really understanding that they were in an abusive relationship. And that's quite common in all abusive relationships, I'd say, is sometimes, people don't tend to realise from day one that's the nature of abuse. And we've spoken about that quite a lot on the analogy of the frog in the boiling water. But that seems to, the sense I get is that's probably slightly exacerbated in minority communities in terms of the awareness of what actually is abusive behaviour. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it goes back to what you were saying before about, kind of don't talk about it, keep quiet. That's the way things are. And sadly, I do think that is, in some respects, it is changing slightly, and that's a positive. But I do think there's still a very, very prevalent kind of feeling that if you do speak out, then you are causing problems. But also, this is, this is part of what married life is like. This is what it is. It is the being controlled. It is the not going out to work or not being able to access your own finances. Being there to look after the children and look after the elders within the family. I think that's very much around the abuse that is unseen to that individual. They just see that as part of their lives. And again, like you just said, it's very similar to, this is where I think if everybody kind of understood, it's so universal. And I always say abuse doesn't discriminate, because if we all sort of understood that it is very similar in lots of different areas of life, that like you've just said, frog in the boiling water, when you're in that situation, you just don't see it for what it is. But I'm just thinking of one person I work with in particular, and they'd managed to leave the situation, and she was no longer welcome at mosque. She was no longer welcome within the community at all, and she was completely on her own. And so to rebuild from that takes an immense amount of strength. I mean, yes, a lot of support as well, and that's where the trust comes in between yourself and the individual. But yeah, it is that fear of losing everything, of absolutely losing everything. But when you're in that situation, and I think for many people within those communities, it is a sense of, well, this is how it is. You just have to kind of put up and shut up, basically.
I guess there's also something around for a lot of people. There must be a language barrier. Language barrier in being able to explain what are really quite complicated concepts when you're not necessarily, the person isn't really aware that they've suffered abuse. Then they have to verbalize that, perhaps not in their first language, perhaps to someone who doesn't speak their first language. So coming to speak to a lawyer and being asked various things and having to set down your case effectively, if you're doing that, that's got to be an issue, doesn't it?
Yeah, and again, and that trust factor comes in. When we talk about the language barriers, years ago, you wouldn't find the choice of languages on a website, a domestic abuse website. So now we do, thankfully. You can pick the language you want to, view the details in. But that isn't necessarily going to make somebody go and look for that support. Again, there's been instances where an individual there was an incident with the police, and they had to wait for a translator. But in that time, the abuser had managed to convince, via coercive control and obviously manipulation and intimidation, to say, this you're not doing this isn't happening. And therefore that person then didn't take it any further. And that's very common as well. sort of saying, I've had a minute now. And that's, again, it's the problem we have with, say, having to wait for the translator to arrive at the police station, or having to wait for the translator to arrive on the phone, whatever it may be. And when people have had that time when the perpetrators have that time with the victim, then, they can kind of turn things to their advantage. One other interesting thing is many British-born professionals who are, as in from Muslim backgrounds, etc., Bangladeshi background, they don't have the language barrier, and yet they still fear seeking support because they don't think they'll be understood. So I think, in essence, the language, yes, 100% is an issue. But over time, hopefully, if we all keep trying to make it clear that, we can be trusted to listen. We definitely need more people who know what they're doing, sadly. But yeah, I think it's a very slow process, unfortunately.
So when you talk about those sort of second generation people from Muslim backgrounds or other communities, I just wonder if you can expand on that. If the language barrier isn't there, but the understanding barrier is still there, is that culturally based? Is that or more just the general wider fear of an abuse victim feels that I'm not going to be believed because I've been told by my abuser that I'm not going to be believed? Are there extra complexities there, even with the sort of second and third generation?
Yeah, I think there is, because I think regardless, abuse is abuse, and what a perpetrator does is rule by fear, by power and control. And I think whatever situation you're in, that's what they will do. I was asked a while ago, it does say drugs and alcohol make somebody more abusive. And I was saying that, drugs and alcohol will exacerbate any situation, but it isn't the reason someone's abusive. Somebody is abusive because they choose to abuse. And I think definitely there is that level of, for those within minority communities, is that it's very layered. I think that's the best way to describe it, is like all these things we've just talked about faith, about language, about ostracization, about all these things. You add all those extra layers, and that makes it so difficult to make that decision to leave. And in some situations, what has happened, and again, this something Dr. Ahmed and I talked about, was when she's worked with women from South Asian communities, Bangladeshi communities, and they've said, I am trying to safeguard my children whilst in that situation. I don't want to leave. I want to stay. And again, that's true in the wider community. I've worked with people who are just, I don't want to leave. I want to stay. And it could be for a million reasons why they stay. There could be a carer. It could be financial. There's so many reasons. But they have been safeguarding their children throughout that process. And I think these are the things we don't see. We just assume that, they are all at risk, and we don't know via each situation. We have to take it case by case. But many people are trying to live in a way where they are trying to keep themselves safe. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough as well, is instead of when people say, why didn't they just leave? Why do people stay? And again, it is very much around, like we just said before, if you leave everything you've ever known and you have to move out of the area and you're leaving a very tight-knit community, I don't think it matters which generation you're from. I think it would be a very, very huge step to take, and a very scary step to take.
We've talked on the podcast previously about sort of the number of attempts it can often take a victim of domestic abuse to leave a relationship. And I believe it's 7 on average. Is that something that's reflected in minority communities, or actually will it be more because of the difficulties and the sort of the cultural differences that we've been talking about?
I think the only way we would know that is if people spoke out more, if we knew more. And I think there's in terms of underreporting, there's underreporting across the board when it comes to abuse. So when I get asked about statistics, I will always say statistics are never a true reflection of what's going on in society, because so many people don't report, And I think it's very true around minority groups. And I think for some who have maybe not had the best experiences with support services, maybe the first time, because of cultural considerations, maybe haven't been considered, then they won't look for support again. They won't reach out. And I think until we do more research and understand more about minority communities, I think we won't know the true extent of whether it is very similar around the, like you say, 7 times or more that somebody attempts to leave. I don't think it's different in terms of the tactics that a perpetrator uses, except for the fact that obviously in terms of what they call so-called honour-based violence. And we say so-called because there's no honour in the violence that is being committed. Those are the additional worries and concerns that those from minority groups have to consider as well.
So, yeah, I wonder if you could kind of carry on with that a little bit and talk about, there's a couple of areas that kind of strike me as being specific really to minority communities. So the so-called honour-based violence, and then forced marriage as forms of abuse. I mean, I wonder if you can unpick those kind of huge topics in a couple of minutes. Nice, easy task for you.
Fine. Yeah. Do you know what? If I go too much into it, people just go, what? So yeah, maybe just break it down a bit. Yeah. So when we talk about, and again, thankfully, it is now referred to as so-called honour-based violence because, as we say, there is no honour in it, and sadly, that is the level of fear that somebody is living in. If we say, well, we know it's difficult to leave in the first place, but if you're bringing shame and blame onto your community, onto your family. I think I said this earlier, it's not just the partner who will be involved in the violence. It will be also extended family. It may be members of the community. And, this is something that we, again, don't know enough about until we have people speak out more and more about it. And there are people speaking out about it, quite rightly so. But I think, that fear. So you're not only fearing, so within, say, a relationship where you're fearing your partner, that's one aspect. If you're then fearful of the extended family, of the entire community, again, it's back to the layers and layers that somebody has to try and break through to be free from that abuse. And, we talk about forced marriage or arranged marriages. And again, the forced marriage aspect, what's really interesting about that is it's not just forced marriage as in nobody consented to it in the first place. It's if somebody is forced to stay in that marriage, that's considered forced marriage. Again, that shame and blame. We always come back to the shame and blame culture. And again, this is something I talk a lot about because one thing that doesn't get discussed enough, and again, this comes back to minority communities as well, is it's the self-blame. It's not just the blame from the community. It's not just the shame from the community. It's the blame and shame that the individual feels themselves, that they've done all this. It's their fault. They've created this situation. They've brought all this shame. And so it's so multifaceted and so layered. Imagine trying to support somebody and explain to them that it isn't their fault. They haven't done anything wrong. Whilst dealing with all these other things that they're dealing with in the first place. But arranged marriage is definitely more around there is consent. There is an agreement. There is that, the families come together, they have that conversation. Nothing is done without either person's consent. So there are areas where, there are definite positives. And I'm not saying that every individual within minority communities experiences this. But again, we go back to research. If we have more research, if we understood more, then we could maybe support better. And I think at the moment we're not supporting brilliantly. And I think that comes down to lack of knowledge, lack of understanding and lack of awareness.
Yeah, so there's clearly work that needs to be done there. I mean, certainly, within the legal profession, I think there's work that needs to be done in working with minority communities. What is it that we and others can do that are coming into contact with people from these communities that are potentially victims of domestic abuse? What can we do so that we can give them the full support that they need?
Yeah, I think firstly I would say ask them what they need, because what we always find is the onus, is always kind of put on them anyway. Well, you need to do this, you need to seek support, but actually, I think as a wider community and as organisations, I think we need to be more proactive in learning more, doing things like this, having conversations like this, bringing more people in to have conversations, getting a better understanding of what it is somebody is experiencing. Domestic abuse is complex enough at the best of times. Adding all those extra layers is horrendous for people. And I think it's definitely kind of that twofold of we as society need to be, because I get that question, sometimes I get the question of, what is it people can do to support themselves? This is in general. And I will always say, why do we always put that back on the individual? Why are we not saying, what can we do to learn more? So when I do talks for organisations and they start to understand a bit more that it's not just about the physical violence, that, we talk about post-separation abuse and things that people maybe have never heard of before. it is that light bulb moment for some people, and they can take that away then and think, okay, so it is about the language that I use. It is about how I approach the conversation. It is about the sensitivity that I have. So it's definitely about us learning more, but also asking the individual, what do they need? Do they need a bit of time? And we have to be patient. And I think it's one of the hardest things, because in any area of abuse, timing is everything. You may find, and I've had this, where people have come for group facilitation. I'm thinking it's all going great, and then somebody will say, I can't continue for now. I'll come back if, and it may be that something's completely and utterly, triggered them, and they don't want to go any further for now. But 6 months down the line, they're 100% ready to take it on and start to rebuild their lives. So timing is huge, it's massive, and we can't rush people. But I think if we were more understanding, that would make things easier. And it's building that trust. We're talking about crossing over communities and we're asking them to trust us, but we have to be able to understand them and understand their background and understand their environment before we can begin to help,
I think that experience of someone coming back a few months later is not uncommon. I've certainly seen it where I thought a client was ready to go and they geared themselves up, and then sometimes there's something has happened and they change your mind. Sometimes it doesn't appear to my eyes that anything's happened. Of course, it might have done. I was just not aware. But it can just, oh, okay, well, we're back to square one, and it can certainly take a while. I think that is exacerbated when dealing with these sort of these issues within the communities and the community pressures. You talked at the start of the podcast about the difficulties where people's support network can often be that people lose their support networks. They can't reach out because the pressure is put on them to not do anything. So, if someone is listening to this and they are, I don't know, they're a wife and a mum from Bangladeshi community who is thinking that things aren't great in her relationship, that she's experiencing abuse, she doesn't know where to turn. Where are some really good places? What some tips to kind of start what can be a very long process to kind of extricate yourself from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if there is somebody that you can trust within your community that you think you can speak to, maybe a close friend, somebody that may understand, somebody that may be already having suspicions that there is something wrong but doesn't want to say anything, and that's true of most relationships with people. I've known lots of people who've wanted to speak out, for their friend or family member and haven't known what to say. I think it's a case of not always, not everybody wants to go and seek support through a service. And again, especially if you are from a minority community, it can be very, very difficult to reach out. I would say school's a very good place to start. If you have children and you want to talk to the school potentially, and they are very good at kind of putting you in touch with the right resources and the right kind of people and the right services. But it has to be down to that individual as to what they want to do. And I think sometimes even watching something like this or finding out just a little bit more information and taking it slowly, not throwing yourself into something and worrying that you need to know everything at once, because it's a lot to take. And also you want people to find the right support, because if they find the wrong support, as I said before, it can be very dangerous and that person will not want to reach out again. So I think if somebody is listening, I would say definitely my resources page has an extensive list of resources from all over, lots and lots of different communities, where people can find useful links to, and if they can't necessarily look at it themselves, maybe when, they're in a situation outside in the public, they could say, could I just, look at that through your laptop, because they may not feel safe enough to do it in their own home. I've known that, and again, if somebody is at work, because I've said this before, many people from minority communities are professionals. I would suggest maybe if you feel confident enough and comfortable enough to speak to your employer, is to have that conversation in the workplace and maybe look at things like this, within the work environment where you feel safe, where you're not going to be, observed as to what you're doing every 2 minutes. And there are ways of doing things. I think we need to make it clearer that there are options. But yeah, we're slowly getting there.
If you have a friend, a family member, a colleague who you are concerned that they are experiencing domestic abuse, they're in the minority community and you're concerned that they're unable to speak out and get support, or perhaps you're in the minority community as well and you are concerned about them, what can you do there? And specifically, I'm thinking about, if we've talked a bit about people not being quite ready to go, what if they're not in a position to go just yet? What can they do? What can you do to help someone, and also make sure that you're, it's quite stressful for you. So how do you deal with that experience yourself?
From the perspective of, say, if somebody is listening who is a family friend or family or friend, I should say, or even work colleague, and you are concerned about somebody, we always focus on the victim and we always focus on the survivor. But actually, those people who are around who are concerned probably are worried about their friend, their family. What we have to remember is you can't force somebody to leave. And it can actually then make things worse if you are breaking down that relationship that you have, that friendship, that element of if it's in the workplace, and you have to be very, very careful, because you can't force somebody to leave. It has to be their choice. And again, it's just, for me, it is opening up that conversation. And, we wouldn't have done this 10 years ago. You wouldn't have had this kind of conversation. It wouldn't have been out in the arena, the public arena, and now we are. And it's that very slow process of building up that trust. But that's what I would have said as well, is we very much focus on victims and survivors, but we forget that there are people who are also concerned about those victims and survivors, and they don't know what to do. So there's no harm if they are concerned, if they want to ring up a service themselves, because that's something I get asked a lot is, well, I'm a family member or I'm a friend. Can I speak to a service? Because I'm not the victim. And I will always say, yes, but you're impacted by the abuse as well, because you are concerned. You know that this, you can sense there's something not right. No service is going to turn you away and say, no, you can't ring up and find out more information. Of course, they're going to say, look, yes, if you're concerned, we can have that conversation, and they'll give them all the right support and advice. But we do tend to neglect those and the periphery who maybe are actually very worried about those people. So I would say to those people as well, you can access support, and maybe then you can find a way of helping that individual within that community in a safe way.
And what about male victims of domestic abuse in minority communities? Are there specific factors and additional considerations that apply to them?
That would definitely would be around. We need more research on that, but also it would be a case of, to a certain extent, a bigger level of shame and blame, because they're meant to be the provider, they're meant to be the patriarch, they're meant to be the leader of the family, if you like, or of the community, depending on what their role is. But again, that's something that you find across all areas in terms of male victims. We've just in Trafford, in Manchester, we just had the first male refuge open in Trafford, and the waiting list is absolutely huge. And there are always going to be those challenges for males in general around accessing support, because obviously it's that fear of being judged, and but I think definitely more within, and that comes back to the faith aspect. I think within minority communities is, a man is meant to be head of the household, head of his family, and therefore if he's being abused, then in my view, I would imagine it's something very, very difficult to open up about, and probably happens very infrequently.
So that's all been really, really interesting, and we're really pleased that you've come onto the podcast today to be able to go through all of that with us, Lucy. We like to end the podcast with some top tips. So perhaps if you could just give 3 or 4 of your top tips for anybody that is in a minority community and that might be suffering from domestic abuse as we speak.
I would definitely say, and by the way, thank you very much for having me on. Sorry, I'll start with that. And also, I would say go with your gut, because your gut is rarely wrong. So if you sense that there is something wrong within your relationship, within the family, then you're more than likely right that there is something going on. And I would say, don't blame yourself. Do not have that shame factor. That it's so easy to say that, but it is so true that it is not your fault. You haven't done anything wrong. If it is safe to find support, then obviously do so. But maybe go through lots of different episodes, podcasts like this. Have a look on my website. There may be something on there, because I think very much for so many people, it's about, whilst you're trying to come to that stage of accepting that you've been abused or you're experiencing abuse, you have to think of your well-being. That's something that doesn't, we always talk about where can you look for support, where's the support, but actually when you're experiencing it, it can take a very long time to leave. Then think of your well-being, thinking, the well-being of the children. And by that, I mean, think of times where you can go and get some respite somewhere, whether it's literally going out for a walk, whether it's talking to a friend, having a coffee, going to a community group and having that bit of breathing space. Because while all this is going on, your life is still continuing, and it's very much around your mental health as well, definitely. So I would say you can't, consider leaving unless you can prepare yourself for such a situation. If you are in a situation where there is no other option but to leave, then obviously there are many organisations and many services out there that will be able to help. If you are very concerned, obviously, then you want to take it to the next level. Then 100%, you have to do what's right for you and what's right for your children, and know that there are people out there that do care and that do want the best for you. And hopefully, over time, we will find that more and more services are more understanding and appreciative of the differences within different cultures, and that we can all start to work together, hopefully.
So that's it for this episode of Stowe Talks. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about the work Lucy does at ydom.co.uk and find her podcast Dip In and Out with Lucy on all the usual podcast channels. If you would like more information on our podcasts, head over to stowtalks.co.uk and please rate, like, share and review this podcast where you can.